Hello, this is Richard Murphy at Tax Research, and I want to talk about something which is quite important to me. That is the difference between tax evasion, tax avoidance and tax compliance. Now these things are a continuum. They move from the wholly unacceptable to the highly acceptable. So let's start with the unacceptable end of the spectrum. That's tax evasion. Now wherever you are in the world, if you commit tax evasion, you are acting illegally. Because tax evasion is the deliberate act of a taxpayer to not declare their income in a way that a tax authority requires that information so that tax can be paid in accordance with the law. Now that's obviously antisocial, it's also illegal, it carries criminal penalties in most countries in the world and civil penalties in a few, although civil penalties are, by the way, by far the most commonly applied. It's easy to understand why that is wrong. It's in some cases easy to identify. It's things like the cash economy. In some cases it's much harder to identify. It's deliberate supply of misinformation, for example, by a company operating in more than one territory with regard to its transfer pricing, or the denial that a company in a tax haven is associated with it when trading takes place through that medium. Now that's also tax evasion, but all of those things, complex or simple, are illegal. Compare that with tax avoidance. Most people in the tax industry say that tax avoidance is legal and therefore tax avoidance is okay. Now, the first thing to say about that is that it's true, tax avoidance is legal, but the second thing to say is that that does not make it desirable. I can think of enormous numbers of things in the world which are legal, which I have absolutely no desire to do, some of which I think are pretty much repugnant. So just because it is possible to do something does not make it desirable to do something, and I make that point very loud, very clear and very firmly, because I do not think that professions have to promote things which may be legal but undesirable. They have a greater ethical duty than that, and an ethical duty is to promote something which is acceptable to society. Tax avoidance, in my opinion, is unacceptable to any society, and the reason is simple. If you are avoiding tax, what you are seeking to do is find the loopholes in taxation law which will allow you to avoid that law being applied to you. After all, that is how the name is generated. Tax avoidance means you're trying to avoid the law. And if you're trying to avoid the law, what you're doing is saying, I do not wish to play my part in the society by paying to the government that regulates and runs that society on behalf of, we hope, an elected government on behalf of an electorate. You don't want to participate in that by paying the taxes that resulting government asks you to pay. Now that, to me, is unethical because it's a denial of your role inside the society of which you are a member. It is as simple as that. That is why tax avoidance is unacceptable. I don't mind whether that is aggressive tax avoidance, which is one of the categories given to it, or simple tax avoidance, which is said to be more acceptable. Aggressive tax avoidance, by the way, is where you are almost certainly trying to abuse more than one groups of legislation. In other words, you're trading in more than one country, or you have investments in more than one country, and you're playing one off against the other. Then you're trying to find loopholes not only inside a country's law, but between countries' laws. And that really is getting to be quite morally difficult and unacceptable. So this is behaviour, however it's looked at, is anti-democratic and antisocial because it means you're trying to duck out of the obligations to society. There is a third choice, and the third choice is tax compliance. It is quite distinctly different, and it is distinguished by the intention of the taxpayer. In the first two cases we've looked at, tax avoidance and tax evasion, the taxpayer has tried to avoid their responsibility to society. In the case of tax compliance, the taxpayer says, I accept my responsibility to the society, or societies of which I'm a member, because this can apply to more than one country, and wish to pay the tax that I owe to that society, but no more, in accordance with the spirit of the law of those countries. And I'll interpret that by paying the right amount of tax at the right time, in the right place, where right is interpreted as meaning that the economic substance of the transaction the taxpayer has undertaken coincides with the way in which it's declared for taxation purposes. Now, let me explain what that last point means. if you're going to get the taxation form of the transaction to coincide with this economic form, the first thing you can't do is, for example, declare that you own your patent or copyright in a tax haven, even though you did not generate the intellectual property that gave rise to that legal entitlement in that tax haven. So, for example, if you're a US corporation that generated a copyright by working in New York, but then wish to declare the income on that out of Ireland, quite clearly the economic substance of the transaction does not coincide with the form in which it's been declared for taxation. That is tax avoidance. Tax compliance would require you to declare that income in New York. Now, I'm aware that there are complexities in life and it's not as simple as that. But if the taxpayer has the intention to meet this requirement of tax compliance, to ensure that as far as possible those two coincide, they can. And I'll explain why they can. Because the world over, the vast majority of people do, day in, day out, practice tax compliance. They actually want to pay their taxes in the place where they're due and don't want to fiddle them in any shape or form. They simply want to say, I pay, I accept the obligation, I want to be a member of this society, I want to get the benefits from that membership, and therefore here is my taxation. This is normal behaviour, and it's behaviour of people who accept that there is a benefit of being a member of that society. The abnormal behaviour is on the part of those who actually try to avoid tax or evade tax. One final point then. If you undertake a transaction where there is a deliberate piece of legislation to encourage you to do it, one of the examples might be that you save money in an account which is deliberately designed to be tax-free, say a pension fund, then if the government intended to give you that tax-free status on that money, so long as you gave up the money into that pension account for the period of time they require, that is not tax avoidance. That is tax-compliant behaviour. The economic substance of the transaction coincides with the taxation form of the transaction because you've given the money up in the way that is required by the government to get the taxation benefit that follows from it. So I make it clear, that's not tax avoidance, that's tax compliance. And tax compliance is okay, even if on occasion it means paying less tax than might appear to be due because the government deliberately induced you to pay less tax by asking you to undertake a transaction in a particular form. But that's not the same as finding a loophole which the government did not intend you to use, either inside your own country or in combination between your own country and another, or tax evasion, where you simply don't report what's going on. Those differences are fundamental to how we should assess the culpability of taxpayers who comply or don't comply with the law. If you're innocent, had a tax-compliant intent but made a mistake, that should not give rise to penalty. If you sought to tax avoid, you should have a penalty because you will try to get out of paying tax, and therefore if it goes wrong, you should face the penalty from doing so. And if you tax evade, that's a criminal activity and the penalty should be very high indeed. That is the basis on which tax compliance activity by governments all over the world who monitor whether taxpayers are compliant or not should be based, and that's why this is so important.